Hello there, friends. Today on History Through the Horn, I'm going to be talking about a real favourite of mine, Stanley Kirkby. Words can't express my admiration and respect for this wonderful baritone. He really dedicated the majority of his life to being a recording artist, a position which at that time was considered to be much less dignified. And despite his later popularity, he kept recording and giving the public great recordings of songs that were unlikely to be recorded by the people who made them famous. Born in the late 19th century, Kirkby's life and career were set against the backdrop of significant historical and social changes. The turn of the century was a time of great innovation and transformation, with the advent of new technologies, shifting social norms, and enlightening scientific discoveries. Within this context, the music industry was also evolving, with the shift from folk and traditional music to the increasing popularity of music halls and vaudeville theatres. There, in that melting pot of change and tradition, science and superstition, Stanley Kirkby was born James Baker in 1878 in Ancoats, Manchester. His parents, George Baker and Margaret Kirkby, were a lower-class couple, living in one of the more industrialised places in England. George worked as an iron moulder and Margaret as a housewife, raising and caring for Kirkby and his older sister. Little is known about the couple or their time together, but we do know that it didn't last long. When Kirkby was only still a boy, his father abandoned the family, leaving Kirkby's mother and sister to provide a stable home for him. Life from this point on remains fairly normal and quiet for the young boy. Mother and sister Kirkby take up work selling candy. There's a relatively stable source of income, and our Stanley is able to be a normal 19th century child, playing with friends, going to church and eventually learning to sing. Times were quite good for the young lad, and though his family were of a lower class, Kirkby never cared. A few years later, at the age of 12, Kirkby found work as a warehouse boy, a tough and low-paying job that was undesirable at best and deadly at its worst. He seems to have worked there for some time, and it makes me wonder if the confectionery business wasn't going that well. If they were making good money selling candy, it feels unlikely that they would make their child work in such poor and unsafe conditions. Unfortunately, the sense of calm and normalcy was abruptly cut short when Mother Kirkby passes away at some point between 1896 and 1901. I can't find any definitive proof of this, but she no longer appears in the census, and I doubt that she would have voluntarily left her family. His sister kept working in the confectionery trade, and by 1901 owned a shop and lived on Oldham Street in Manchester. By this time, Kirkby was 22, still called James Baker, and working as a tobacco packer. He was just then starting to discover his talent for and love of singing, but was only just starting to put it to use and in less a capacity that he'd go on to do. His singing career began in around 1900 when he started performing at local events around Manchester. One of the more notable of these events was when he was a soloist in a fundraiser event held at the Palace Theatre of Varieties in 1900. That next year he won first prize as a baritone singer in a contest held as part of the Music Trades exhibition at St James Hall in Manchester. By 1902, he was performing at provincial events and in musical comedies, like when he played a small role in The Geisha in Derby in 1902. It was at one such event in 1903 that Kirkby had caught the attention of the good folks at the Gramophone and Typewriter Company. It's likely that he happened to be performing in a hall in London that a member of the G&T staff just so happened to be attending, and his bold, strong voice sparked their interest. They introduced themselves to Kirkby and invited him to make a few test records at their studio there on Maiden Lane. As far as I can tell, none of these discs were issued, but by 1904, his name starts showing up regularly in the catalogues. Recording staff, record buyers, and Kirkby himself soon realized that he had a voice particularly suited to recording, one of that was strong enough to sing at high volumes without losing its tonality. This newfound potential was not lost on the young Kirkby, and soon after his first sessions with G&T, he was touring England and recording for most every company around at the time. The recording industry in England at the time was quite different from the one in America. The British didn't take to the new technology in the same way the Americans did, and as a result it was thought of as a very low-class form of entertainment. It was referred to as canned music, and had about as much appeal to the upper classes then as canned food does to them now. This meant that very few celebrities made any records in the early days, and the people who did make records weren't treated with the same amount of respect and made to sing under numerous pseudonyms to inflate catalogues and incentivize under-the-table payments. Kirkby was no different, and he recorded primarily under pseudonyms rather than his own name. This might sound odd to some people today. Surely listeners would be able to easily recognize a singer under multiple names, right? Not quite. Record speeds were so very inconsistent at the time that you could get your Walter Miller record, play it slightly too slow or fast, and hear no resemblance to our Kirkby. The earliest name used was Frank Miller, which he used occasionally on his early Edison Bell cylinders. Others include Walter Miller, Stanley Barnes, F. Elliott, Keith James, and Charles Lester. While making these early records, Kirkby kept up his stage career, and even appeared on the same bill as Mary Lloyd at the Metropolitan Music Hall in 1905. In his earlier stage work, he performed primarily sentimental ballads and light opera, which were both in high demand in the music halls. His gift for singing on stage and in front of the horn kept Kirkby very busy in 1905, and his number of engagements only grew over time. Even though Kirkby's on-stage repertoire consisted primarily of ballads, light opera, and even some oratorio. In the studios he gave rousing renditions of nearly all the popular comic songs, and did so with as much energy and gumption as any stage star could. When a big-name singer had a hit song, they would take quite some time getting to recording them, if they ever did at all. So the studios would have folks like Kirkby fill the demand for these songs on record. This worked very well for Kirkby, and for the next few years he kept working primarily behind the horn singing his repertoire of ballads, as well as whatever comic songs the staff required of him. In 1907, Kirkby was involved in the founding of the Premier Manufacturing Company, who would go on to make 2-minute wax cylinders called Clarion records and 5-minute cylinders called Ebenoid records. It isn't known exactly what role Kirkby filled there, but I assume it was more to do with financial contributions than business ones. He did sing for them, though. He made numerous Clarion records and even a few Ebenoids. By this time, the disc was beating cylinder sales by quite a bit, and only 3 years after its founding, the Premier Manufacturing Company folded and went out of business. Kirkby kept recording for pretty much whoever would hire him, and his popularity grew to the point that by 1909, he was being paid £90 a week, £9,189 and $11,579 today, according to Joe Batten. Kirkby's wealth allowed him to move to London and marry his sweetheart banjo player and member of the White Coons, Jessie Jolly. They moved to Barnes, London, one of the most expensive and exclusive areas to live in the city, and there they held lavish concert parties that went on to make Kirkby and his friends popular amongst a whole new demographic. Though Kirkby had gained a respectable amount of fame and notoriety as a phonograph singer, he still desired success on the stage. Things weren't really taking off for him in the halls and theatres the way they were on the phonograph, and it must have been rather frustrating for him. Regardless of any frustrations Kirkby might have had, he kept trying and changed his style and stage persona to find something that would stick. In 1911, he appeared in a group Can't the Quaintons, and they did receive some acclaim. Here's a review from the Stage magazine. Stanley Kirkby's Quaint Uns are newcomers this week and quickly get on good terms with the audience, in spite of the fact that the exigencies of time preclude anything more than an opening chorus and 2 concerted numbers. The first quaint thing one notices about the Quaint Uns is their costume. This has the appearance of a made-to-measure pyjama suit of blue material with white Peter Pan or Quaker cuffs and collars. The party look very smart and original, and their work is quite in keeping with their appearance. Unfortunately, very little is known about this quaint little seemingly short-lived group. I could find no photos, no date for the creation or disbandment of the group, and no information on who the other members were. By 1916, the much more well-known and long-lasting group of Harry Hudson and Stanley Kirkby had already made their debut and were quickly gaining traction, so it's unlikely that the quaint uns lasted more than 3 years, if that. Unfortunately, the good times were not to last, as only 3 years after Kirkby first popped up in Barnes, the First World War broke out, and Kirkby immediately enlisted. Many British singers joined the fight, and many came back mentally or physically mangled, if they even came back at all. Charles Mott was shot and died from his wounds. Robert Easton lost a leg and spent 3 years in hospital. Lord only knew what our poor Kirkby was going to face during his time on the battlefield. Fortunately for us, though likely upsettingly to him, Kirkby was rejected and sang for another 20 years after the traumatic and horrific war. Kirkby's activities during the war aren't specifically known, but he did make many patriotic recordings, and it's very likely that he sang to entertain the British troops whenever possible. During the latter years of the war, he toured the music halls with Harry Hudson and became quite successful singing songs written specifically for them by the writing team of Weston and Lee. Kirkby's time working as a duo with Harry Hudson is one of the most notable aspects of his career. Many folks both then and now know of Kirkby specifically for his role in the group. They received very high acclaim from their very first show. One review reading, "Popular newcomers to the bill this week are Stanley Kirkby and Harry Hudson, who are making their first appearance in the West End in a double turn." They score one of the hits of the programme with syncopated harmony. Both gentlemen possess fine voices, and we thus get ragtime sung artistically and not shouted. Altogether, the duo are to be congratulated upon the excellence of their performance. They managed to gain enough notoriety that the recording companies began to see the pair as a major asset and were quick to hire them to record all of their hits. They remained successful well into the 1920s, and as far as I know, they never fell out or broke up. In 1925, Kirkby performed in a burlesque revue called Apple Sauce. The songs were interestingly written by Weston and Lee, the fellows who wrote the Hudson and Kirkby tunes. I wonder if Kirkby's connection to the two led to his being part of the show. It garnered quite positive reviews, with one reading, "Rarely has such long sustained applause greeted the fall of the curtain on any review at this house as was the case." When Applesauce, thanks to the smart production work of the brothers O'Gorman, went without the slightest hitch and scored an emphatic success. 3 years later, Kirkby returned to Variety Entertainment with a concert party held in Margate. It isn't known how successful this was, but the return was only for a year, so we can assume it didn't prove to be worth another go. All throughout the 1920s, Kirkby kept working, recording primarily on Edison Bell Winner records covering a variety of genres from more jazzy tunes to the classic ballads he was associated with in his younger days. He never lost a beat, and his voice never lost the bright, warm quality that endeared him to so many. During the 1930s, Kirkby tried his hand at radio broadcasting, appearing on a number of variety shows, some with his old partner Harry Hudson. I can't find it said anywhere how long he worked in radio, but it is a seldom discussed part of his career. I have heard none of these broadcasts and suspect that none of them have been preserved. Unfortunately, I don't have any information about this period of Kirkby's life, but I think it's safe to assume that he retired and got some well-deserved rest. There are no records that I know of from later than the mid-30s. I can't find any mentions of live appearances from the time, and by this point, Kirkby would have been an older man, especially for the time. Kirkby and his wife had 3 sons in the 1910s, all of which would have been adults by the mid-30s. Kirkby's lack of public presence from then until his death was likely just him settling down and spending some time with his family. But now we come to the part of each video that I dread writing every time. The part where I have to tell you that this beloved person who I've just spent 10+ minutes talking to you about died. In Kirkby's case, it was in his home in Barnes, London, on October 30th, 1949. But it gives me great joy to tell you that he died loved and respected by all who knew him. When writing his autobiography, Joe Batten recollected Kirkby fondly. Quote, "He had the finest recording voice of all the artistes I have heard in recording studios. It was a pure baritone. His diction was perfect, and he had a versatility in interpretation that distinguished him from all others." Kirkby was undoubtedly one of the most notable figures in the British music industry during his time, and upon listening to any of his thousands of recordings, one can instantly tell why he was so respected and admired. Thank you all for watching and listening. Tune in next time when we talk about French stage star turned phone singer, Charles.
Don't make this the end, dear. It's never too late to mend, dear. Poor little Glenn.